Are buffering agents such as sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate enhancing our performance in previously unrecognized ways? Welcome to the Science of Getting Faster podcast, where we cut through the headlines, talk directly to the researchers to find out what their studies suggest, what they don't, and where their research is heading. My name is Sarah Laverty, and with us on the podcast today, we have Dr. Jason Siegler. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Siegler.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So today we're going to be discussing your research paper, The Hyperhydration Potential of Sodium Bicarbonate and Sodium Citrate. Could you start by telling us what is a buffer?
Sure. So really, a buffer is something that's naturally produced in the body. We have a number of different ways of producing buffers that handle a lot of excess protons or the acid that you might feel, that burn that you might feel during high intensity exercise. Our kidneys are responsible for maintaining a certain amount of blood buffering in the body. And that's really the focus of a lot of my research is on that blood buffering capacity. But there's other ways of handling that as well. You can increase your respiration or decrease your respiration to try to blow off that excess carbon dioxide. Those are the two main ways that are referred to as extracellular buffering. We have an intracellular inside the muscle cell means of buffering as well. There's a couple of other ways. You might be familiar with beta-alanine. That's another supplement that's used to try to mitigate or reduce the amount of acidity that you might be experiencing in the muscle.
Okay. And so am I right in saying then we're trying to keep the blood within a certain pH range with these? Is that the function of these buffers?
Sure. So what we're trying to do is trying to keep the cell functioning really. So during high intensity exercise, oftentimes the metabolic pathways that are responsible for providing energy to the system or to the body are oftentimes stressed, right? And so a lot of that stress results in a production of this excess acid. And so that acid has to be removed from the muscle. And one of the ways it's facilitated out is through the means of buffering and being attracted out and picked up by this blood bicarbonate. And so that response is exactly what you're trying to explain there. And that's to try to maintain our body's pH or just keep us in a homeostasis.
Okay, that's helpful. So I'm aware that chemistry might intimidate some of our listeners, and perhaps me included. But I do think it would be helpful to understand, how does that happen? How does our blood become more acidic during exercise?
So it's basically a function of protons and cations and anions. So you've got your pluses and minuses, the charge associated with that. And that will increase or decrease the blood's acidity levels. And so we just try to maintain a balance between where the body normally sits at around 7.4 in terms of blood pH. And then during exercise, obviously, we have that excess acidity that's coming out of the muscle. And so what we try to do is try to balance that and try to get that blood pH back up to around 7.4. So we can do that. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. It depends on how long you're exercising for, how intense the exercise is. And that will dictate how quickly you're able to recover and able to return to the pH of what the body is normally expecting to be at around 7.4.
Okay. And can we train that capacity, our buffering capacity?
Good question. Certainly, there have been a few studies that have shown muscle buffering capacity to be improved with training. The blood itself probably stays around the same regardless of your trained status. So, you and I both sitting in the room, whether I'm not training and you are training, we're probably going to sit at the same around, in terms of blood buffering capacity, we'll probably sit at around the same level. But so that part really doesn't get trained so much. Diet can influence it a little bit, not so much, but diet can influence it a little bit. But really, it's the muscle buffering capacity that can be trained to an extent. But yeah, so that not so much the target of something like sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate, a couple of the buffers that we use to mitigate that acidity level. So that's slightly different to that. More focused really on the training capacity and the training adaptations associated with the muscle that can improve that muscle buffering capacity. So that first line of defense, if you will.
And how do we train that? Is there a specific session?
That's a whole nother podcast, probably.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No, I think it's really just dependent upon the individual and sort of the training load or block that you're undertaking at any given time. Really, it's about looking at trying to increase that anaerobic capacity or improve something like your lactate threshold, or working above threshold, or in certain zones that sort of sit you above critical power. Those kind of threshold markers or indices, really, and it's kind of yo-yoing back and forth. I think any number of different training strategies can work to improve muscle buffering capacity, but really it's probably related to making sure or ensuring that you're stressing the muscle sufficiently above what it's sort of normally able to or what it's normally able to handle in terms of acidity coming out of the muscle and metabolic demand. So I guess there's a whole host of ways of doing that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. How long, without supplementing with sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate, how long does it take for our muscles or our blood to get back to that more that physiological range where we're trying to get back to? How long does that take?
So I guess it depends on how long you're exercising for. So I guess in a normal, really highly stressful bout, you can probably go for anywhere between 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 minutes, as at sort of if you're at a sea level environment, at sort of an all-out pace, right? So once you reach that limit, and again, that will be dictated by your training status, how your muscles are coping with that increased metabolic demand. Once you reach that sort of state, the amount of, well, not just acidity, there's a whole host of other factors that are involved in fatigue or muscle fatigue, but the acidity level is just one contributing factor. But once you reach a certain point, your body will pretty much tell you when to stop. And once you reach that point, whether it's 2 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes, maybe even 7 minutes, depending on who you are, if you've gone to extreme levels and you've really exhausted the system, then it can take anywhere from probably, well, I'd say 5 to 10 minutes for the blood pH to recover. And that doesn't mean that your muscle function is recovering. It just means that your body has come back to at least a level that's sort of commensurate with before the state that it was at before the exercise. So in terms of blood acidity, there's all sorts of mechanical issues that can come about with stressing the system to an extent like this, or really stressing the system to its anaerobic capacity. But in terms of blood pH recovering, we usually see it recovering probably by about 15 minutes, as long as you're just sitting still and recovering. Your blood bicarbonate, which is that buffering mechanism that we referred to, that takes about 15 minutes, I'd say, or so, 15, 20 minutes to come back. Okay.
So looking at your blood bicarbonate and your pH levels, that would give you an indication as to whether you've recovered or how acidic your muscles are?
I think so. I mean, it's one indication, right? I think, really to look at how well your muscles are recovering, you can do a lot functionally and just measure the functional return to baseline that, in terms of, there's other ways of looking at neuromuscular function or even strength recovery or power recovery. So that may be a pretty good gauge. Measuring the blood, I probably wouldn't lean towards using that as a gauge of recovery necessarily. It's just a reflection of what's going on metabolically, I think, is probably a better indicator. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned how food can interact with someone's buffering capacity. How so?
Yeah, I mean, to a to a small extent. I shouldn't get too far down the rabbit hole here, but a lot of times when we measure baseline blood bicarbonate or baseline pH in the lab, if our participants are heavily into the protein side of things, sometimes they're slightly more acidic. Nothing that I would quantify or qualify as being significant, but you do see a slightly decreased or more acidic pH. But again, once I don't think that has any real impact on performance per se. I know that there has been some work done on food substances like alkaline greens. We've done a little bit of work in that space, not a whole lot, and haven't seen a lot change in the blood in terms of those food products, resulting in some kind of, at least acutely, changing in the blood. So your body's pretty good at regulating pH and certainly the blood buffering capacity and keeps it pretty clean.
So it might have an implication on your research, but doesn't have much of a practical application.
I think more anecdotally is how we've noticed it. Over the years, I've probably been in this field for about 15 to 16, 17 years looking at blood buffering capacity. And I guess I would say I've just noticed it rather than looked at it specifically.
Definitely. So we were describing there the natural buffering system. So that explains why we might use some supplements to buffer.
Sure.
What is the purpose then of supplementing with those buffering agents?
So I mentioned the blood buffering capacity, and your body regulates that quite tightly. And so you'll sit at around 25 millimoles per liter. Most people will sit at around 25 millimoles per liter in terms of the measured amount of bicarbonate in the blood. So the idea really is that blood bicarbonate helps draw out those protons or that acidity out of the muscle. So it attracts it, grabs hold of it, brings it up, and you're able to blow it off as carbon dioxide. And so the idea behind it basically is that if we can increase that amount, then potentially we can exercise for longer, right? So we can keep facilitating those protons coming out of the cell, maybe keep metabolic function going for a little bit longer, drawing those protons out, blowing that carbon dioxide off for a little bit longer period of time. So basically, the theory behind it is you're able to exercise for longer at that given intensity, so at a really high intensity or a really high rate. When you ingest sodium bicarbonate at the levels that we typically do at around 0.3 grams per kilogram body weight, we generally see around a 7 to 8 millimole increase in the blood, and that increase will it can occur quite rapidly depending on whether or not you're in a fed or a fasted state. We can see increases upwards of within 20 to 30 minutes if in a fasted state. In a fed state, probably takes a little bit longer to get through the gut. But generally, we see the same sort of peak responses at around between 5 to 7 millimoles per liter. And so basically what you have is you have a larger tank, right, to handle that acidity that's coming out of the muscle. And so in theory, you're able to handle more of that acidity and exercise for longer. So that's sort of the premise behind it. And blood bicarbonate is relatively easy to measure in the blood. And so we're able to track it quite quickly. And so we can verify that our blood bicarbonate levels are increased. Whether or not that direct increase is a direct result of increased performance that's been measured is I guess a little bit debatable, but that's the premise behind it.
Yeah. You mentioned a very high intensity. Mm-hmm. What are we talking there? How high are you talking?
Yeah, I'd say probably 110, 120% of VO2 max, maybe. So really, really maximal efforts that can be sustained for, like I said, a period of probably 2 to 7 to 8 minutes. So a typical exercise bout that we would use in the lab might be a 2K rowing or time trial. that sort of falls within that window. Or you've seen a lot of research in the space of 800 meters to 1600 meter races. Those kinds of sustained anaerobic pushes that really require the body to function at a really high level and really push yourself to the limits. So, the use of sodium bicarbonate is probably something that we should talk about, because you're talking about very, very small margins of performance improvement, right? So one of the reasons why it's not very widely used is because it does come with some side effects, or it traditionally has come with quite a few side effects, or potentially anyways. So to mitigate or to reduce those side effects, oftentimes you need to be very regimented in how you load. You need to be very systematic. You need to make sure you're consuming enough fluid and carbohydrate to try to reduce some of the GI symptoms. And so that becomes probably a 2, maybe even a 3-hour process, depending on the person, prior to exercise. So quite often that will sort of negate the use of sodium bicarbonate for your sort of recreational user. And I would probably argue that it's not necessary for the recreational athlete. I think you really need to consider it if you're competing at a pretty high level, and you feel as if you're sort of tapping out that anaerobic side of your ability before you would consider consuming sodium bicarbonate prior to a race, and certainly not prior to a competition before trialing it out in training, because it does come with some side effects. The reason I can explain that real quickly. One of the reasons why it comes with such a high amount of GI stress is because basically you're ingesting a very, very high amount of sodium, and that big charge, if you will, that gets into your stomach causes a very big carbon dioxide shift into your stomach, and so that is what can cause the cramping, bloating, even diarrhea in some instances, depending on the individual, really. So symptoms is something that we really look out for and really work to try to reduce.
Okay, and what buffering agents are typically used then? You said sodium bicarbonate. Is there?
Yeah, sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate are probably the most common. Sodium citrate has probably gained a little bit more traction in the literature over the last couple of years, and I think that's really due to it doesn't seem to cause quite as many GI issues. But the sodium bicarbonate is probably the most researched in terms of extracellular buffers. I'd say I certainly didn't start the process. It was going probably, I think the earliest of trials in terms of exercise performance were in the mid to late 70s. And then it's been really sort of heavily researched ever since in various contexts, looking at different ingestion protocols, looking at different usages, in terms of athletic events, certain events, maybe at different applications at altitude or not, or under various different contexts.
You're raising a lot of questions now, and I'm trying to make sure I hold on to them.
That's okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So you said between 2 to 8 minutes is when you can sustain that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would it be helpful in, say, a bike racing scenario where you have multiple surges? So, sure. Or is it only beneficial for one?
That's a good question, and something we've thought about looking at in the lab, but really difficult to do, because certainly if you think of the theory behind sodium bicarbonate, right? So it's meant to help sustain high intensity exercise, really, right? And so exactly what you just said in long cycling events where there might be a hill or a breakaway or something to that effect, I would say certainly you could consider it. One of the things that sodium bicarbonate will do is when you ingest it at the suggested levels, it will stay in your blood we've monitored it for 12 to 24 hours before, and it'll keep your blood bicarbonate elevated for, I'd say significantly elevated into what we would sort of call an ergogenic window. I'd say upwards of 6 hours post before it starts to drop out of that. So, if you think about the context with which you could use it, then that kind of opens up a lot, right? So if you have a road race, right, for example, that may last 2, 3, 4 hours, then, there'd be no reason why you wouldn't consider it. I don't think. Measuring that in the lab is quite difficult, and I don't think it's been done. Just probably due to the logistics of performing an extended race, multiple hill climbs, etc., repeated by X number of subjects, and my head starts to spin with the amount of time you'd have to spend in the lab to do that in a controlled scenario. I am aware of cyclists using it in that context, though, and I have spoken with a few dietitians and sport nutritionists that do implement that strategy with some of their distance riders, just for the pure fact that, if it is in the blood, if it's there, for them to use, and there is a breakaway or there is a hill climb, then potentially, it could benefit them for sure.
Would you expect the GI symptoms to last as long as the potential ergogenic impact that it's having?
Yeah, no, that's a good point that you raised. I think, the GI symptoms, if we do see them, are generally pretty quick. So within the first 10, 15 minutes, but most of the time by 30, 45 minutes or so, they are reduced to a level that is sort of, non-significant, I would say. And I, again, going back to the individuality of it, that some people can tolerate a whole lot of sodium bicarbonate and not have any issues with their GI system. Others really respond poorly to it. And so, you really, this idea of trialing and error, or trialing it out in training in sort of, non-competitive situations is really where you need to start, because like I said, we've seen people it's become symptom limiting, and others that it doesn't bother. And so on that note, on the loading side of things, there's been a few papers out that we follow actually, when we use as guidelines for loading, including a little bit of carbohydrate, about 1 gram to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight when you start to ingest the sodium bicarbonate. Along with, about 7 to 10 mils of fluid per kilogram body weight. And the other thing you can do is stagger the ingestion period. So one thing that we used to do in the lab, because it was a quick and dirty way to do it, was we would go to the supermarket, buy some sodium bicarbonate or baking soda off the shelf, bring it back to the lab, mix it up with some cordial, about 500 mils of fluid, and then have our participants slug it back within 10 minutes, right? So in a fasted state. So oftentimes that was sort of the benchmark for GI disturbance, right? And then we've gotten kinder over the years, but actually, that situation is certainly not something that you would introduce to an athlete, right, or a competitive athlete, right? So a lot of the work over the years is focused on different intake formats, such as pills. So all the time, we'll put it in pill form now, which obviously can mitigate some of the flavor, the issue of flavor or adverse flavor when you drink it. And then we'll stagger those pills out. So if if you're a 70 kilo person, then you're probably looking at around 21 grams, and we break that up into 3 or 4 different 15-minute ingestion phases, if you will. Couple that with some carbohydrate and some fluid, and more often than not, if we've got 90 minutes to give our athletes prior to exercise, the symptoms are quite low, if not really non-existent. So that's one format. I know now also there's some enterically coated pills that bypass the stomach and go straight into the intestine, and that seems to really eliminate any sort of GI distress. So there's different strategies to do that. And getting back to your original question is, if you can overcome those symptoms, if you do have symptoms at the beginning, they certainly will be gone by about an hour into it. So if you think about that, then your blood buffering capacity will be elevated for another 3 or 4 hours after that as well. Another strategy that's used a bit is topping up. So some athletes will, they'll do an initial load, and then 2 or 3 hours in, they'll take a small amount again, just to top up that buffering capacity. So that's certainly something that you could consider, and then you're taking a very low dose that second go around, and probably not experiencing any side effects in that case.
Got it. Okay, and the differences between sodium citrate and sodium bicarbonate, are they different mechanisms of action?
Yeah, so slightly different mechanisms of action, and it can get quite complex. And sodium citrate, I don't think, has really been studied to the extent of sodium bicarbonate. Bicarbonate will change the blood bicarbonate levels in that we spoke about earlier. Citrate really has, I believe, more of an effect on the plasma positive and negative charges, or those those positive and negative charges. I won't even bother saying that this morning. In the plasma. So there may be, once the sodium and the citrate disassociate in the plasma, there's more of an effect on what we call the strong ion difference. And so that's sort of the theory behind what sodium citrate is doing. It also takes a little bit longer for that to occur, for that to change, but yeah, slightly different mechanisms.
Okay. You mentioned that one of the constituents of both of these buffering agents is salt. Is that what has prompted this research question?
Yeah.
What question did you have leading into this?
Let me give you a little bit of context behind that paper. So that study occurred when I was back in Australia. Spent 10 years in Australia prior to coming back to the States a couple of years ago. So that study was an arm, if you will, of a much larger multi-center study that was sort of the brainchild of Meg Ross and Louise Burke down at the time they were at the Australian Institute of Sport, very well-known sport nutrition dietitians in that space. And so what they were looking at was revisiting their hyperhydration guidelines, or the substances that the institute or the sporting institutes were using as recommendations for hyperhydration leading up to the Tokyo 2020 games. So there was a number of different centers or research groups around the country looking at different aspects of those hyperhydration strategies. So the buffering study that we ended up running along with Amelia Carr down in Deakin was really the only one that looked at using or implementing the sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate into that strategy. And that was something that's relatively novel. A novel piece on this. There's been a few papers out looking at rehydration with sodium citrate, and I believe one with sodium bicarbonate, but nothing really looking on the buffering side of things. And so the actual buffering side was the reason why it was included was exactly what you mentioned there. It was because of the sodium that goes along with the buffers. And so that component, there was another arm of the study that not that we ran, but another arm of the study that looked at just sodium itself, and some of the other research that's been done. So the whole premise was really just kind of revisiting what the recommendations were within the institute, and that study kind of came out of that. And so basically what we were framing our research around was some of the sodium work that's been done already in the past in terms of how much sodium is used when it is used in that hyperhydration context. And then all we did was try to match that sodium load with our levels or the amounts of sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate to see whether it was comparable and to see whether or not those loads or those amounts really would induce a similar sort of buffering response, or in terms of buffering capacity, as a normal load would be. And so when we were doing the sort of sodium equivalent calculations, it works out so that a lot of the studies using hyperhydration in terms of sodium obviously are focused around salt intake. So we just had to equate the sodium in that sodium chloride equation with the sodium the same amount of sodium in the sodium bicarbonate levels. And so what we ended up with was just a slightly lower level of sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate that would normally be taken, but that was only done just so that we could match what had already been published in the research. So we had some comparable benchmarks to look at and compare.
Right. So you're effectively trying to say, with this being the goal of hyperhydrating, can we also get a double whammy effect?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So if you're going to introduce it, then is there any benefit of introducing it in the form of sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate, right? And so that's exactly what we're looking at. The only difference really was probably the amount of fluid that we had the participants ingest, was because we were trying to match that hyperhydration strategy that was already out there. It probably doubled the amount of fluid that we would normally have our participants consumed. Not that matters a whole lot, but that was probably the only difference, along with that slightly lower level of sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate that an athlete might be recommended.
So it was double the fluid intake that you would normally recommend with sodium bicarbonate.
But oftentimes we don't limit the fluid because it helps, like I said before, mitigate some of the side effects. Obviously, there might be a slight concern about body weight, but if you've got enough time, then we've seen a little bit of changes in body weight, but not a whole lot. This is just something that we did for the study, just to try to, again, be able to match it with some of the published data out there.
Definitely. So what is hyperhydration, just so that we can come back and make sure that we understand what it is? It's
kind of like buffering capacity, or increasing your buffering capacity, right? So the idea behind hyperhydration is basically to increase your body's total body water content prior to an event where it might be really hot, which is what the Tokyo Games were. Which is what they were, right? Really extreme heat conditions. And so basically what you're trying to do is provide yourself with a little bit more fluid so that you're able to sustain things like cardiac output or cardiovascular function or sweat rates or these kinds of things that keep the body cool and keep the body functioning for longer periods of time in the endurance context. So hyperhydration is really, again, just trying to increase that amount of fluid that's available to the system, really.
Got it. What are the current strategies for hyperhydrating?
I guess, I don't spend a whole lot of time in this area, but, to my knowledge, I would say, the use of salt is certainly one that's common in the literature. Glycerol is another one that has come and gone. So there was a lot of research in the 90s with the use of glycerol as a hyperhydrating agent, because it does a really good job of attracting water into the cell and sort of tricking your kidneys, if you will, to not recognize that increased fluid load quickly. But then it was placed on the banned substance list for a little while, for not so much as a hyperhydrator, but it seemed to mask, I think, some other diuretics, to my knowledge. But then now it's back off the list. So the last couple of years, we've seen a few more papers come out with glycerol back in the fold as far as a hyperhydrator goes. But people have used water. I think one of the issues with water, though, is that you end up urinating a lot of it out. Okay, so the addition of the salt or the addition of some other osmotic constituent will help keep that water into the cell, as opposed to being excreted out in the urine.
Got it. Okay, so that gives us a good overview to dive into this study that allowed you to answer this question. So who were the participants that you had for this study?
Yep. They may be offended by this, but they certainly weren't highly trained athletes, and that was the purpose. So again, to go back to the purpose of the study, it was really just to revisit what was happening with some of the current recommendations of the Institute in terms of hyperhydration, and whether or not, if we tailored that or changed that subtly, what would happen in terms of the physiological responses to the body, right? So there was no exercise component. and they were also in an environment where it wasn't hot. So those are two sort of limitations in terms of efficacy, right? In terms of effectiveness. So again, we were just simply tracking some of the changes in terms of body water content, or at least in terms of plasma volume expansion. So the participants were volunteers, most of them coming from the lab or having spent a lot of time in the lab. And they also ranged in size, and that was on purpose because we have just to make sure that we had a wide range of body types in our measurements, just to ensure that the changes that we were seeing were pretty robust across different body sizes.
And you had males and females participating.
Yeah, we had males and females, yes. And another sort of limitation of the study was the fact that we didn't control for menstrual cycle, which could certainly affect it. But yeah, so that is, we did have males and females in the study.
But it also increases the application so that women... Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. And there's certainly a trend, probably long overdue, or certainly long overdue, for more women to be included in research studies now. Another podcast, which
yeah. Sure. Well, thanks for including them. So prior to attending the laboratory, what were the participants' instructions?
Yeah, so we just had a standardized approach to them coming into the lab. Because the budget was limited, we had to make a few recommendations. We did have them standardize their fluid intake before they came into the lab, and we ensured that they had an adequate level of hydration coming in. So we did measure some hydration indices when they came into the lab, and if they needed to, they would have been given more fluid. They didn't in this case, but they would have been given more fluid so that we could start with an adequate baseline. So the in terms of the diet, basically what we did was we had them track what they ate, what they consumed for dinner, and then we standardized because they came in fasted, we gave them a couple pieces of toast for the ingestion. But basically, what we had them monitor what they ate the day before or the night before, just so that they could replicate it the next time they came in, more so than having the funds to control for the actual diet itself.
Right. And the participants, they all came in for all three trials, is that correct?
Correct. Yep. So it was a repeated measures design, and we randomized the trials that they undertook. And so because it was a multi-center study, we were part of the buffering condition. We had, so Amelia and I both split that. She had some sodium bicarbonate, sodium citrate trials along with the control trial, which was just flavored water. And then we did the same up at Western Sydney. So with that, we ended up with almost 20 participants covering a wide range of, again, like I said, body types, body sizes, and males and females. Great.
And what baseline measurements then were you taking to get a sense of their hydration? And
so we did urine-specific gravity, which can tell us a lot about hydration. We did urine color, which is a simple functional way of looking at. There's a lot of urine scales that are out there that any athlete can use or any trainer can use to get a good idea of how hydrated they are prior to exercise. So urine color, USG, we weren't able to measure plasma osmolality, which is another common measure when you're looking at hydration. And we measured body weight, but that was more so at the beginning so that we could monitor how much the fluid influenced that over the course of time.
Okay. The urine color, how reliable is that as an indicator of hydration?
It's pretty reliable. I couldn't quote any of the studies off the top of my head, but I know there have been a few reliability studies looking at the use of urine color scales. And I think, it's not so much the scale itself, it's how it's administered. So the instructions that are given, the standardization that's given, and the compliance of the individual that's monitoring it. But I think, if all of those things are controlled quite well, then it can be a quite accurate indicator of hydration status.
If this is a very rudimentary question, but I'm just interested. So if we're aiming to absorb more water and the urine color indicates how much water is coming out, doesn't
necessarily indicate how much water is coming out. It will just give you a bit of an indication as to whether or not there's adequate fluid in your body. Right?
Got it.
So you could be hyperhydrated or overhydrated, and you'll have the same color of urine as you would if you are normally hydrated. That makes sense. It doesn't get any clearer after a certain point.
Right. Okay. Got it. Right? Thank you.
So it doesn't tell you how much you've got in there. It'll just tell you your sort of status at that moment, in time, if you will, hydrated or not hydrated.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So the procedure then you took for the 3 experimental trials, can you run through that for us, please?
Sure. So we incorporated, again, kind of a standard loading sequence where we gave them some carbohydrate in the form of toast. We had a standard fluid amount that was based on their body weight. And we did that, again, that amount was based off of previous literature, not necessarily something that we designed ourselves. And that, again, was because we wanted to compare our changes in the blood and changes in hydration status to the published literature.
Do you know how much that was? How much fluid?
20, I believe it was 20 mils per kg body weight.
Okay.
And then it was not in just water, it was a flavored cordial, non-caloric cordial. So that was the fluid, and that was spaced out over the course of an hour, along with the pills, with which they took the sodium bicarbonate or the sodium citrate in. So we evenly spaced the pills out. Those pills equated to the amount of sodium that was equivalent to that 7 grams of salt that we were equating the sodium load to in the previous literature. But depending on the size, maybe they had 6 or 7 pills per person, or maybe it was 4 if they're a really light person. But those were spread out evenly over the course of the hour, again, trying to mitigate the side effects with that load, but also try to, sometimes we would push that out a little bit further. Like I was saying before, if there was a competition or an event post ingestion, we probably would push that time period out a bit further. But again, that wasn't the aim of the study. The aim was simply to look at the fluid changes in the body and the hydration status of the body over a 180 minute window. So again, really controlled, as opposed to maybe what we would do with an individual athlete, where we would space it out a little bit more.
How much more would you typically space it out if you're working with an individual athlete?
Well, if it was buffering that I was trying to improve, or buffering capacity, if I was trying to improve that, I would say I'd push it out to 90, maybe even 2 hours prior to. I would say you'd be okay, because we were looking at whether or not bicarbonate or citrate was changing the hydration status, and we wanted to shorten that window out a little bit, right? So getting as much fluid as we could to see what kind of retention we were getting over a shorter period of time. So the focus was slightly different. And because it hadn't been done before, we were trying to profile something, and sort of the initial attempt was just profiling it over a shortened window of time.
Would that time frame then reflect a hyperhydration protocol?
More similarly, I think. Yeah, you generally will see that sort of 60-minute hyperhydrations in a lot of the studies, and a lot of the sort of salt studies and the glycerol studies will be maybe 60 to 90 minutes in terms of the window. Yeah, I mean, you're kind of balancing you're balancing out the practicality of it versus the mechanism side of things, right? Trying to look at various things, right? Because you want to understand something in the context that it might be used, but you have to control it to an extent, right? And keep it realistic. So it's kind of it's a fine line, because if you think about, hyperhydration is for endurance events in the heat, right? With those endurance events are probably 90 minutes, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, whatever that might be, right? extended periods of time. So I think, tacking on another 60 to 90 minutes prior to it, the shorter you can get it in, the more applicable it might be, right?
Yeah,
to the athlete.
Definitely. Yep, definitely. And you were measuring bloods as well. What were you looking for in there?
Yeah, so with the bloods, we use the bloods for two reasons. We wanted to obviously measure buffering capacity because, like I said before, the participants were taking slightly lower doses than what we would normally recommend, and by slightly, maybe 5 to 10% lower. But we did want to see if that had an effect on blood buffering capacity in any way, or changes in blood buffering capacity. The other thing we used the bloods for was to measure hemoglobin and hematocrit so that we can get an estimation of changes in plasma volume, or the expansion in plasma volume that's often looked at in studies involving hydration.
Got it. And you were measuring these throughout the trial as well?
Yeah, so because it costs quite a bit, the profile of this is a little bit less robust. I mean, the measures that we could do in terms of urine output, urine color, USG, urine specific gravity, measuring the fluid volume of that's taken in and the fluid that's excreted out. That's quite easy to do, and that's why we measured it, in the time sequence that we did. The bloods, we had the budget to measure them every hour on the hour, which is not atypical, I don't think. I mean, oftentimes, there's enough research literature out there now that, profiling changes in blood buffering capacity after you ingest sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate, you kind of have a pretty good idea after an hour, and certainly after 120 minutes, you'll be elevated. And so really it was more the absolute change that we were looking at. We didn't really need to profile the kinetics, if you will, of the change.
Definitely. So just to recap then, we had the participants participating in the 3 trials, which were sodium bicarbonate, sodium citrate with the water or the fluid, and then the placebo, which was the fluid on its own. Is that correct?
Yep, correct.
Okay. And what did you find then?
So what we saw was we saw typical changes in the blood buffering capacity, slightly lower in the sodium citrate in terms of improvement in blood buffering capacity, but I think that was more related to the time frame of our measurements. If we had extended that measurement out, I think sodium citrate probably would have been just as elevated in terms of blood buffering capacity as bicarbonate. So that was encouraging because we did give them slightly lower doses. The other sort of main finding that we saw was in terms of fluid retention. The sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate trials, although they're slightly different, the retention was around 10 to 11 mils of fluid per kilogram body weight, which is comparable to some of the sodium or the salt hyperhydration studies. We saw, again, similar to other studies using just salt, we saw plasma volume expand to a similar extent, around, I believe it was around 6 to 8% in terms of the expansion. And that's very similar to some of the salt trials that are out there. So I think, for me, it kind of confirmed what we had thought, right? So if you equate the amount of sodium across these trials, then you would expect, and you give them the same amount of fluid, you would expect to see similar findings. I guess the real novel aspect was just as you mentioned at the beginning, was getting more bang for your buck, right? So you could actually then also increase your buffering capacity if you wanted to, if you were looking to hyperhydrate, keep the fluid in, and you may have an event where there are breakaways or anything to that extent in the in an endurance context. Then my question would be, why not? Why not use it instead of salt? And
what did you find with regard to the GI discomfort?
Yep. So that's what I was just going to mention.
Sorry.
So no, it's okay. I think I was going to qualify what I just said with, as long as your athletes are able to handle the disturbance. And I guess, we did measure quite extensively subjective measures of discomfort. And, on a Likert scale from 0 to 10, we probably averaged around 2 to 3 scores in terms of how people were rating it. And again, you might say that's nothing, it's minimal. Or, if you're an athlete that is very sensitive, then maybe that is, scoring 2 or 3 or 4 on the Likert scale of 10 in terms of discomfort. Sure, then that's something that you would want to consider. So again, I guess it just comes back to all the different combinations that you could change based off of this study, right? So you could look at extending out the loading time, right? You could look at changing some of the fluid volumes. Ultimately, you're probably going to end up with the same amount of, or a comparable amount of say, plasma expansion. Maybe it's not for quite as long, or maybe it's for longer periods. It depends, right? But if, really what your goal is to try to increase a bit of fluid in your system, increase your buffering capacity, then potentially, working from there, you can work towards reducing any of those GI symptoms by including a little bit more food, right? Because, like I said before as well, you're not going to come into a competition fasted or only having 2 pieces of toast, right? So I think it's something that you could certainly trial prior to competing in training, not in competition.
As you mentioned, yeah. So as you mentioned, you can try to mitigate some of those effects of GI discomfort by consuming, maybe altering the water or the fluid that you consume with it, and then
absolutely, well. Yeah, okay. Absolutely. So I think, and again, going back to the premise of this study was really the ultimate goal was reevaluating prior to the Olympics, right? Reevaluating the strategies that were given to athletes by the Institute. And so, they are just that, they're recommendations, right? And so those recommendations can always be tailored to the individual. Okay. You're looking at the mean responses from a group of non-athletes, right? And although you could argue it probably would be the same for athletes in terms of the conditions that we put them under, it might not be. So I think, the individual variability is something that you can work from. So I, take what we've published and what others have published and look at that, and then go from there, right? Tailor it to meet your needs. Maybe you love drinking water, so have a little bit more water to it, right? Or, there's all sorts of different combinations that you could consider.
Definitely. Did you notice any patterns with regard to sex or body mass in their response to the GI discomfort?
Honestly, no. And that that's, I would say, not just in this study, but in all of the studies that I've conducted over the years. It's something that you watch for, right? You watch for people, how they're feeling. You're giving them a substance that can cause them a little bit of GI distress, right? So it's something that you're constantly sort of monitoring. If you're not monitoring it, systematically, you're physically there in the lab talking to them. And I'd say over the years, I probably had hundreds of subjects in the lab, and I can't really tell you who will feel it and who won't. You could have a large person, big body type that has to take a lot of sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate, not feel a thing. Others, because of the load, will really not feel very well. So, I've yet to sort of pinpoint a body type or a certain personality, if you will, that will tolerate it better or worse. So it really does come down to the individual and trialing and error and trial and error.
Do you know if many of those, you're saying that this was reevaluating the hyperhydration strategies prior to the Olympics? Did many athletes utilize this protocol?
So that's a good question. The buffering arm of this study that we conducted, we completed just prior to COVID coming, which shut everything down, right? So the 2020 Olympics obviously became the 2021 Olympics. And so at that stage, the data was really too new and too late to implement into these games. The strategies that were in place, a while beforehand, in terms of prior to the games. Whether or not, it's going to be reevaluated in the next instance where there's competition in really hot climates. I know that those discussions are ongoing for sure. But as far as increasing, I should say, introducing sodium bicarbonate or the buffers themselves into that hyperhydration strategy, to my knowledge, no, not in these games. There are other elements of the study that still sort of are ongoing. One of the interesting bits that we were able to partially complete was we did add another arm in there that had bicarbonate and glycerol in it, which didn't make it into the paper because it wasn't a complete data set. So there's other combinations that we're still looking at. And again, really more so looking at the main outcomes, right? So if you introduce two hyperhydrating osmotic agents on top of each other, people have looked at glycerol and salt together. What happens if you introduce glycerol and sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate together? What does that do? Does it change anything? So I'd say those questions are still out there being looked at. But yeah, in terms of the application for those games, I would argue that the sort of tried and true salt or some of the other hyperhydrating strategies were implemented prior to those games, and certainly in those camps leading up to them.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a really exciting and novel area of research with lots to explore still.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of looking at something that's been used for quite a while in a different context, right? And just kind of exploring some of the different ways of implementing it. I've probably spent the last 7 or 8 years looking at different ways of implementing sodium bicarbonate into different sort of non-traditional sports, right? So, for example, we've looked at it and the effects of buffering and creating a real alkaline condition in the body to improving explosive force, certainly, and then in a fatigue state. So then that kind of introduces a whole another context with which potentially you can use it. So there's other instances in which you need to kind of consider. We've also looked at it, or are looking at it, in terms of the effect on some of the afferent or the feedback mechanisms going up into your brain and your ability to pace. So there's all sorts of different applications, I think, that still need to be explored in this context beyond the hyperhydration concept or idea.
Well, we might need to get you back on for that. It sounds fascinating.
Anytime.
Yeah. So if we were to conclude, what does this research say and what doesn't it say?
I think, if I was going to summarize both sodium bicarbonate and sodium citrate together, I would say that, if you are interested in incorporating a hyperhydration strategy into training or into a competition, and you want to look beyond just using salt, or if you've used glycerol in the past, I think, it's something that you can consider. And I think the reason why you would consider it is because of that added buffering capacity or increase in buffering capacity that you would also get in with the buffer ingestion. So I think, but again, Sarah, just to reiterate, the context, that you're looking at are really sort of your high level performers, right? Not me going out on the weekend doing a couple of intervals, right, in the heat here in Phoenix. I don't know if I would notice much of a difference or get much of a gain, a physical gain from that. So I think it's just looking at who you are as an athlete, what sort of position you're in, what getting all the other aspects of training right before you dive into the realm of the quagmire that is supplements. And I guess the only other thing I would add to that was, I mentioned off the cuff, really the buying the sodium bicarbonate off the shelf. And when we have done studies with athletes, and certainly competitive, Olympic level athletes, we've always had the buffer third party tested. So I think that's something that you really need to look into, because if you're just measuring blood buffering capacity in the lab and changes as such, it's fine. It's safe to do in the lab with your non sort of athletic population. But if you're actually competing, then it is certainly something that you'd want to consider. And I would highly recommend is make sure you're getting your bicarbonate from a certified source.
Definitely. Thank you very much. That's super helpful. So where can our athletes keep up with your work or learn more about you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I missed the boat on the social media front. A number of years ago, I was told by my institution to create a Twitter profile, which I do have. I'd have to look up what that is.
I think I follow you. I can find it somewhere.
Yeah, I did notice that, so that would be great. Yeah, I'll let you disclose what that Twitter handle might be. I don't tweet that often. I think for me, I've kind of used it as to go back and forth between there's some good stuff out there, and there's a lot of wading through a lot of the bad stuff. Certainly, my position right now, I'm at Arizona State University. You can find me on the faculty webpage. I'm actually sitting as director of human performance in this focus area that we have within the College of Health Solutions. So I'm easily found that way. You can find my email, and I am, given my age, always responding to emails still. So that would probably be the best way.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks, sir. My pleasure.
Thanks.